Good afternoon and welcome everybody. I have the great pleasure of introducing Patrick Boyer, but just before I do, I just want to mention about the Gallery in the Woods, because some of you may have been in there and seen some of the work, and some of you may be going there afterwards. I want to acknowledge Greg and Susan Hindle, who have been artists in residence with Muskoka Chautauqua since the very early days and great supporters. Sue is now on our board. Greg has been teaching workshops here this week, and they will be back on Sunday. They have done a magnificent job of hanging three kind of different kinds of themes in the gallery, and I just wanted to acknowledge them and say how much we appreciate them. So as I was saying, it really is my greatest pleasure to be introducing Patrick, because, well, he's just such an incredible guy. He's such a champion of social justice and of Muskoka Chautauqua. And as a matter of fact, he's been really very significant in the rebirth of Muskoka Chautauqua, and we appreciate his vast and deep knowledge of the history of Muskoka and how all of these pieces of the puzzle kind of fit together. So I'm really, we're grateful about that. He did give me some notes here, and I found some of my own. I'm just going to take a minute because I think it's really important for you to know, who he is and what he's been doing. So these are sort of about this afternoon, and then at the end I just want to talk a little bit about the social justice aspect. So our feature speaker for this afternoon's segment of Muskoka Chautauqua 2021 is historian and author Patrick Boyer. I'm happy to welcome both Patrick and his wife Elise back with us again. He has been with us a number of times in the past. The topics which we are now going to learn more about is what Muskoka was like a century ago, the 1920s, and why that decade became widely known as the Roaring Twenties. Patrick is a fourth-generation Muskokan with two sets of great-grandparents homesteading in the district at the time of Confederation. He's worked as a printer, lawyer, journalist, television host, filmmaker, university professor, and member of parliament. Patrick is author of 25 published books of history, law, politics, biography, and public policy. He recently launched a Modern History of Muskoka series, which is being well received by Muskokans and those beyond our district. So I was taking a look through some of his blogs, websites, that kind of thing, and it just really reminded me of what a significant champion he is for social justice. And if you don't mind if I just read some of the things I found here, they're quite remarkable. Because patterns in society emerge through the interaction of institutions and individuals over time, instead of quick fix reforms, Patrick believes that improving conditions requires a shift in culture, which entails a lifetime of engagement on many fronts. In a universe of double standards and unequal sharing of wealth and resources, his approach to a just society is not theoretical, but pragmatic, to create justice by removing injustice. Operating as a participant observer, Patrick's impulse for justice has included supporting legal resources for victims of wrongdoing, attentive integration for vulnerable people on societal margins, safeguarding the public commons from commercial and environmental predation, ethical conduct of public office holders and individuals occupying positions of trust, and social harmony based on equality of all and special privileges for none. Such a trajectory led Patrick into journalism, law, politics, advocacy, and work with diverse organizations. He founded the Northern Institute for Public Policy, Breakout Educational Network, and the Corrine Boyer Fund for Ovarian Cancer Research and Treatment, today Ovarian Cancer Canada. He chaired the Couchiching Institute for Public Affairs and the Pugwash Park Commission in Nova Scotia. His memberships in civil rights, environmental, and writers' organizations include PEN and the Writers' Union of Canada, enable support for and engagement with their causes. In specific ways, he devoted himself to the health and well-being of women, vital democracy achieved through citizen-centered governance, interpreting and sharing Canadian history and heritage, fostering, awakening respect for Indigenous people, law reform, and social justice, and accountability in government. And I think, you know, those are the things that really matter today more than anything else. And we're in this very critical time and moment where we're so grateful to have champions like Patrick. Please welcome Patrick Boyer.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Gail. Gail and Gary Froud, and your son, Gail, Sean, who's here, have done so much to revitalize Chautauqua in Muskoka, and that is of fundamental importance. So it's very important because of what Chautauqua represents in the society we're living in today. And so I greet you as fellow Muskokans and fellow Chautauquans, and great to be in the Theater in the Woods, which is certainly a Muskoka Chautauqua tradition, because back in the 1920s and 30s, Muskoka Chautauqua on Tobin's Island had a theater in the woods, which was had the stage and the whole everything you'd want in the theater platform. With drama students from the University of Toronto and Harthouse basically having a great summer over on Tobin's Island, putting on plays. There's so much just to talk about Chautauqua, and we will get to that at the back end of what I'm going to say today. But as you know from what Gail has said and what you perhaps saw on the website, we're looking at 100 years ago in the district of Muskoka, at the Roaring Twenties. And it's a very interesting phenomenon that some decades actually acquire names, and they stick because they're so apt. So there was the gay 90s, which from the 1890s, which had nothing to do with sexual orientation and everything to do with just being gay and fey and having a great time, and that was true in Muskoka, but also it was backstage. You know, there was another life being lived by a lot of Muskokans. It wasn't everybody all the time having a gay old time of it. But we get to the Roaring Twenties, and then after that comes the Dirty Thirties, right? And then we don't really get another name for a decade until the Fabulous 50s, what some of you might remember. And more recently, not names for decades. I think it reflects perhaps our more self-centered, somewhat narcissistic culture that's emerged now. That instead of naming decades, we name generations that are living in those decades. So the millennials, the X generation, the Y generation, the Z, you know, etc. Beyond the back end of it, you can keep track of it. But the reason that the 20s were called roaring is what we're going to look at this afternoon. And when you look up the word roaring, it's got a lot of different meanings. And all of those different meanings actually apply to conditions and phenomena that were taking place during the 1920s. And I'm going to slice into this topic in three different ways that we can first look at the impact of major phenomena like the wars and the Spanish flu, that kind of thing. Then the second way we can come through this, we'll be looking at the revolutionary impact during the 1920s, here in Muskoka as elsewhere, of new technologies. Very significant. And then third, we'll take a quick look at social and cultural transformations. The thing about the decade of the 20s is, of course, it's a decade, it has to have 10 years, right? But actually, we'll just move it back 1 year, because I would say that the 20s really got underway in 1919 with the end of the war and the Spanish flu pandemic, and continued to 1929, 10 years, with the stock market crash that brought on the dirty 30s. So with that, it's important to bear in mind that the essentials were still intact for Muskokans. And what the essentials are is a place that's the southernmost edge of accessible edge of the Canadian Shield, in close proximity to the populated south, the cities of southern Ontario and the cities of northern tier industrial American states. So what had always been the case from the 1860s and 70s on, why Muskoka, just really a lot of land when we look around, but a very small patch of the whole Canadian landscape, became far famed, very, very well known. It was because of location. The fact that this was the most accessible place for people that wanted to escape the city and the heat and the oppression of the summers in those cities, for a place that was convenient and wilderness and close to nature. And that, to this day, remains as the raison d'etre for Muskoka, as this bridge, or this hinge, perhaps, called a hinge, between the metropolitan values of the South and the hinterland values and culture of the Northland. And here they merge and mesh up and in varying degrees of success, and sometimes with a bit of controversy, but ultimately that creative tension between North and South is what blends so well in Muskoka and creates in Muskokans really a rather unique people on the planet. So what were some of these major phenomena that we're going to look at as the first slice of this? Well, the Great War ending. That war was an industrialized war with mechanized applications to killing and disabling beyond anything to that time. What had been invented and discovered for the Crimean War and then advanced in the US Civil War in the 1860s was all fast forwarded from the early part of the 20th century in the Great War. It was called great not because it was wonderful, but because it was big, immense. 8 different world empires at war. The British Empire, the French Empire, Belgian Empire, the Russian Empire, the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Empire, and Japan, the Japanese Empire, which in the First World War were on the same side as the British. So, and our focus tends to be very limited to the Western Front and the northern end of the Northern Front, in fact, because that's where the Canadians primarily were fighting, not exclusively, but so we just see a bit of the action in our lens, but that was a vast war, and it got underway in a lot of stages, and it ended in a lot of stages, and the fact that on November 11th at 11 a.m. every year we have Remembrance Day makes a lot of people probably think, okay, the war just ended on that day at that hour. It was never, wars are never neat and easy, they're messy and confused, going in and coming out. The 2 most dangerous times of any war, anywhere, anytime. And the back end of the Great War, First World War, Canadians still were involved up into 1919. Part of the effort in the intervention in the Russian Civil War, because there were 4 of the dynasties, the monarchical monarchical dynasties overthrown in the course of the First World War, including the Tsar of Russia. And the Canadians were among those who were going in to try and fight with the White Russians to overpower the Red Army of the Bolsheviks. And so that war really was hanging on into 1919. With it was coming the Spanish flu. And the great thing about this current pandemic that we're experiencing is that we're actually living inside of a historic event. Each of us is a participant observer in history being made and understanding what it's like when world forces over which we have no control beset us. And it becomes our time to respond. And how we respond doesn't start all on one day either, or end all on one day. It takes time to figure out what to do. And in the case of the Spanish flu, which didn't originate in Spain, it originated in China and came with the Chinese labor corps to France, because by 1917 and 18, it was not clear who was going to win the First World War. And in the realm that we, with the British Empire, were involved, it looked as easy as possible that Germany was going to prevail as our side in that war. And in France, I mean, people in our country and in Britain and in Germany and in France were boiling and ready for revolution. And in the case of France, there were mass desertions from soldiers from the front. There were work stoppages in the war factories, and those soldiers who were deserting were being shot at by other soldiers, and to fill the manpower needs in France, they brought workers from China, where an influenza was already developing. And they were crossing the oceans to get to France in crowded ships, incubating this virus, right? And the Spanish flu, unlike typical virus infections, which tend to impact elderly and younger people, seem to have a real preference for the demographic 20 to 40, 45-year-olds. Well, that's the perfect profile of who was in uniform, the soldiers, right? And so this gets to France and starts to spread from where the Western Front is, from the Swiss Alps right up to the North Sea, all in and out. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of soldiers in terrible conditions, filthy conditions, great for close quarters, great for spreading, right? The epidemic, making it a pandemic as it gets into more and more countries. And that's indeed what happened. And they were being moved around from this front to that front, and then back to hospitals for treatment. And then troop ships coming back with the wounded to Canada. And that is how the Spanish flu got into Canada in 1918 and continued in 1919. And ships arriving in Halifax as fast as trains could carry those soldiers back across Canada. It was fanning out. Now, there's two things just to get off this point, because we could be talking about this, you know, till midnight, and not even get to the 1920s more. All the countries, I mean, most countries were belligerent powers in the Great War, and therefore they had press censorship. For some miracle, Spain managed to stay out of the First World War. So they didn't have any press censorship. The Spanish doctors were no better than doctors anywhere else at identifying why people were having these incredible symptoms and dying atrocious deaths very rapidly. But when they did it, the French newspapers carried the stories, and it was on the front page. This was the first time in months of, by now, millions of people dying, that there was any news about this. So it became called the Spanish flu, right? It's like those elm trees that we pass on the farms driving up here. They're dead, the elm trees, those beautiful elm trees, and everybody says the Dutch elm disease, right? Well, the Dutch didn't, it was just a Dutch scientist who happened to discover what was causing it, you know. So sometimes you can get a bad rap by having open press or being a good scientist. But so that was the first thing. And the second thing that's more significant for us is that it was official policy by the government of Canada and the Canadian Armed Forces to have totally tight lips. I won't do that again. I told you wars don't always end. You know, there's still a sniper in the war. It's like that Japanese fellow who was still found on an island 27 years after the Second World War ended. He was still defending the cause. So there wasn't any word in Canada about this disease. The military did not want information about mumps or pneumonia or venereal disease or other things that were debilitating our troops getting out, because it affected morale in the forces, and it was considered intelligence of importance to the enemy. So nothing was ever said except that, oh no, yeah, there's some kind of flu. It's like a cold. It travels fast, but it's quickly over and it's not serious. Quote unquote. Those were words from press releases. Plus, on top of it, there was press censorship in Canada, right? So nobody knew. Nobody knew. Can you imagine, like, why I said it's important, because we're living through this similar history. From the time it began, we were getting 24-hour, 7-day-a-week coverage, right? Breaking news all the time, everywhere. Well, it was 180 degrees different 100 years ago with the Spanish flu. And so it spread, and it spread into Muskoka, and there was no Department of Health and Welfare in Ottawa at that time, didn't exist. In the province, there were like health boards, but mostly it was the municipalities and the public health officers that were dealing with this locally. And so in Muskoka, the newspapers were publishing information about how to respond to this, and there was quarantine. Dr. Peter McGibbon, who was a public officer of health in the central part of Muskoka, you know, commandeered a hotel. It was converted into a hospital for only people who had Spanish flu, and that's where they were being treated. There's a lot more to be said about the number of deaths in Muskoka of mothers and their children, of families that were decimated, and across Canada. When you go in a cemetery that's been around a while, you'll see an inordinate number of tombstones marked 1919, 1920. But let me just keep moving on, because all the details, there's far more to say about that, but as Gail has said, this afternoon is kind of your advance look at a book that'll be out this coming winter called Muskokans Embrace the Roaring Twenties, Riding a Roller Cycle Decade, 1919, 1929. And it really is a roller cycle, roller coaster. What did I say, motorcycle? I better have some more of this straight gin, right? Okay, that was roller coaster, up and down, because it was certainly that. So speaking of drinking my gin up here, let's come to the third thing. After the Great War winding up, and after the Spanish flu coming through and killing, we're talking 50 to 75 million people worldwide, Spanish flu, on a par with the number of civilians and soldiers who perished in the four and a half years of the First World War. So those are big things to have been responded to by people in any community, and in my books, of course, it looks at the authentic lives of real people to show what happens when things occur that we didn't create, we didn't want, but we have no choice except to respond to them. So the third thing was prohibition of alcohol. And this is hard to imagine today, but there were strong forces wanting there to be a society free of alcohol. And it's important to remember that from the earliest times of European arrivals on the continent, there was liquor. And even those Puritan Pilgrim Fathers that landed and down the States, at Plymouth Rock, they had 18 barrels of beer out in the hold that they brought ashore. That was just part of their meal long after they had their first inaugural church service to commemorate their safe arrival. PEI, Prince Edward Island, from the first days of it being a colony, was awash in booze. So these problems were there from the outset of European colonization of North America. And at first, the idea was temperance, balance. Take a temperate approach, have a drink, sure, but don't get smashed every afternoon at 2:30, and stop drinking so that, you got all your money spent, because a lot where the taverns were strategically located. They were between the factories. When you worked 6 days a week, and you get your paycheck on the Saturday, or it wasn't a paycheck, you'd get your money on the Saturday, and between there and your home were 5 taverns, right? And this was throughout the U.S. and in many, many, many parts of Canada. So by late Saturday night, when the breadwinner arrived home to be upbraided by a wife who was hungry and children who were hungry, and there was no money, all she ended up getting was a beating, and the kids went hungry yet again. So there were a lot of social issues that said, we got to do something about this. And if temperance doesn't work, where you're telling somebody, just take a moderate approach, well, let's go for the full thing. And so the temperance movement actually morphed into a prohibition movement. And strong in this district, there were under the statutes of the time, it was which predate Confederation, local option, and local communities could vote whether they wanted to have alcohol available, and whether it was going to be spirits, wine, beer, or all of the three. And so on January 1st, 1920, Prohibition came into effect in the United States of America in all 48 states at that time, because it had been an amendment to the Constitution, which meant it had to have been passed from both houses of Congress in Washington and then ratified by 2/3 of the states' legislatures. And for that to have happened tells you something about just how strong this drive was to live in an alcohol-free society. Moral uplift was what the whole thing was about. Let's live a better life. And so with Prohibition starting in the United States then, right at the start of the 20s, which contributed to organized crime and more consumption of alcohol, and it took them until mid-1930s under FDR to repeal Prohibition there. This was Canada, and we had actually been into the whole thing much earlier. In 1898, the Laurier Liberal government of Canada held a Canada-wide ballot question on whether or not there should be prohibition. And I'm a Democrat. I believe in democracy. I believe that citizens have a right to have a say in big decisions that are going to affect how they live their lives. And And so a lot of people said, well, see, that nothing came of that 1998 referendum, because all the Protestant English-speaking provinces voted overwhelmingly in favor of prohibition. In Quebec, Roman Catholic and having drinks and enjoying that kind of life predominantly voted to stay, against prohibition. So people said, oh, see, the country's divided. The country's not divided. The referendum just held up a mirror to show you what the divisions that existed actually were. That enabled an astute prime minister, Wilfrid Laurier, to say, okay, we cannot have a single national policy on alcohol consumption. So we're going to leave it to the provinces. And under that, the provinces were voting back and forth, and in 1919, Ontario had voted for prohibition. So all these soldiers were coming back to a dry province, right? And just before the war, we had votes in Muskoka and in Gravenhurst, they voted wet. In Huntsville, they voted dry. And in Bracebridge, it was like 2 votes dividing between 50-50, right? So what happens on these various votes is that hotels that had lounges and there's taverns and so on in the town, they sometimes had to close, and they couldn't sell anymore, or if it went wet again, they'd get their licenses back. So it was this kind of yo-yo back and forth. So what happened in Ontario and in Muskoka during Prohibition in the 20s is a very lively chapter in this upcoming book, because it coincided with something else I'm going to mention in a minute about the election of a coalition government in this province. It was neither the Tories nor the Grits, the Conservatives or Liberals. It was a farmers and Labour government, and they were totally supportive of most of them of enforcing prohibition. And a special squad of the police was formed to enforce, and we're talking now police forces armed with machine guns, and there were some, especially down in the Windsor area, but elsewhere in Toronto and so on. There was a lot of violence in the province in relation to those who were trying to supply the demand for liquor. Maybe in more recent times, some of you remember going over to Dunn's Pavilion at Bala, and you go in and everything there, Louis Armstrong there with this big pile of white handkerchiefs on the piano, and he'd come mopping as he'd play, and the white tablecloths on the tables going right down to the floor, and you'd go in and you'd sit at the table, and the women particularly were carrying very large, heavy bags in, and putting them, whew. And then they'd come and ask, what would you like at your table? 2 ginger ale, 3 soda, 1 Tom Collins, and then everybody was sort of mixing, right? And as the evening went on, and everybody was getting a nice glow on, but Bala was notionally a dry municipality, right? So take that, and that was just in our recent times. A lot of us remember doing those things. Go back in the 20s, and it was big time. The speakeasies, the places you could go for getting alcohol, and the bootleggers. Everybody knew where the bootleggers in town were. And so this was something else that added a roaring dimension to the 20s. And just to finish that point, what happened as it really began in British Columbia, and then Alberta, and then it came to Ontario, where they said, this experiment is backfiring big time. It's not working. It's counterproductive and producing new problems. Okay, so but those militants for temperance, prohibition, they were still there too, and they all vote, right? So how do you handle this? Well, step by step, the Canadian incremental way. And so here is another stage in the rise of the positive state in Ontario. And by the end of the decade, the government had decided it would control liquor sales. and it would license. So you'd have the Liquor Control Board of Ontario, LCBO, is selling in the stores and licensing bars and taverns, that kind of thing. And places like Windermere House, it was Mary Liz Aiken held out as long as she could, to keep it dry. But she ultimately had to yield to what the clientele was wanting. So there we've come through now the Prohibition. There was a fourth thing here that was really important and different, because this was what I call awakening a Canadian nation. The 1920s is when a whole new appreciation for who we are as Canadians and what this country was all about came into being. It certainly began with the war, when, Britain, as the mother country, went to war. She took her children with her, and we had zero say in whether or not to participate. And it was the same for France and the other, other imperial powers. They looked to their colonies to provide soldiers in unlimited supply, food, manufacturing of munitions, and all kinds of other supports that were needed. And Muskoka totally geared up for that war industry. But the cost of lives of Canadians, the expectations that the British had of what they could demand of us, caused Prime Minister Robert Borden, who was here at the Royal Muskoka on Lake Rosso when the war was just breaking out in 1914. He rebelled, and he began to insist that Canada would be a signatory to the peace treaty, which it was, the Treaty of Versailles, 1919 in Versailles, France, that we would be a member in our own right at the League of Nations that was created out of the Treaty of Versailles, forerunner of the United Nations today, and that we would simply make our own decisions in our own parliament about when we would send soldiers wearing the Canadian uniform overseas to other countries' wars. So that was kind of the military, constitutional, getting rid of the British harness that we still to this day are confined in. But that was just part of it. The bigger thing was, that Tom Thompson had been coming up and staying at Huntsville and going into Algonquin Park and painting, and before the war, and he was influencing other artists. And so when Tom died in 1917 in Algonquin Park, they continued, Barley and all the others, in the group of 7, Casson and Harris, and they were expressing in a new way what it felt like to be Canadian. How the woods would actually be painted, not in the schools of art of continental Europe or British schools, but a Canadian view on it. And I wrote a biography about Jim McClure, Canada's greatest law reformer, and he was in Huntsville when Tom was painting, and because his brother was a doctor, and McClure's brother was a doctor in Huntsville, and they were close, and very close with Tom. And Thompson told him, he took him into the hotel in Huntsville and spread out these canvases, the sketches that he'd done in the park that he'd take to Toronto and do the big landscape paintings from. He spread them out and said, pick any couple you want, just as a gift. And so Jim McClure did. But Tom said, when I take these to the city, they will criticize the establishment art publications, and the big wigs of art in Canada will criticize my style and what I see, and the colors are too vivid and so on. So it wasn't easy, but it was a very important thing that the group of 7 did, and they went around the country not in Toronto, but all to Stratford and Peterborough, Windsor and Sault Ste. Marie and all kinds of places, talking and showing and spreading the word. And kind of the people got on side with this. And it was a groundswell where it matters if you're just starting to have a different cultural view of your country, right? That the people feel this, and they did. And so I was going to say something at the very end of my talk about Muskoka Chautauqua, but I'm going to include it now to go with this, because basically what the Group of Seven did for Canadian art, well, there was a section between what I was going was about civil aviation, and I'd worked so hard to get that timed right. And Gail, if you hadn't gone on so long reading so much about me, now I'm really confused. Okay, I'm going to talk about Chautauqua because to finish that point, because what the Group of Seven did for Canadian art and this new burgeoning awareness of who we are as Canadians and how we see our country through Canadian eyes, not European eyes. Canadian artistic values, not somebody else's, school of art thinking. Well, Muskoka Chautauqua, which became known as Canada's literary Chautauqua in the press, the national press, did for Canadian literature, in terms of this new sense of who we are as Canadians, what the Group of Seven did for art. Now, how did that happen? Well, quickly about Chautauqua. Where it began was in the United States, of course, on the south side of Lake Erie at a place called Chautauqua in 1874. So, within the decade after the U.S. Civil War had ended. And the northern states, New York and Ohio and Pennsylvania, I did it again. Yeah. Three and I'm out, right? Their cities were dirty. I mean, there were steel mills and iron works and steam-operated engines, burning coal, whether for train engines or in factories, propelling all the mills and everything. So those places were really foul. And in New York, came one of these, back to the land movements. These are cyclical things that happened. Like in the 60s, we had a lot of people going back to the land. And they went up to Chautauqua, and it was about getting close to nature, escaping the city. And it became a very celebrated thing, and it spread, and it was a movement. And families went, and they were particularly religious on theirs as well. It was like kind of summer religious camps down there. And but being close to nature and reading books and having lectures and everything, you'll even notice on the website that this was built as a lecture here tonight. And my boy are giving a lecture, right? See, it's honoring the Chautauqua traditions. And it spread throughout the United States, and it spread into Canada. And at first, the whole thing about the Chautauqua was, it was bringing the world to you. And the world was musicians and writers and dramatists. And so going out into the smaller parts and the rural communities, people that didn't have any access to higher art and culture were getting it. And the Chautauqua would arrive, and they'd have these big tents, brown, to differentiate them from the white circus tents of the circuses. So you knew if you saw a white tent, that's where you could go and see the pirouetting bears and dancing on balls and stuff. You saw the brown tent, you could go in and hear somebody play a violin, read a poem, and put on a little drama. And so in Muskoka, the mobile, that was supposed to be the end of my bit on civil aviation. We had it in Bracebridge in 1929 and 1930. We had the Chautauqua there that was organized. And to organize those mobile trips going all around the country, you got performers, musicians, equipment, timetables, people paying in advance for their tickets. You know, being an air traffic controller is a piece of cake compared to what they had to do in organizing all this. But they, in August, a week in August of 1929, and then again in 1930 in Bracebridge, they had this big tent down Jubilee Park, and it was the talk of the town. But you can see by those dates that it didn't really matter anymore if you were bringing the world to you, because what had happened, other things that I was going to have talked about by now, in the technological part, radio had come in big time. And so you didn't have to even go to the brown tent, you just turned on your radio, right? And over at the theaters, the silent movies in the 1920s had been replaced by the talking movies. And so it was much easier for people to understand what was going on in the world without going to the big brown tent. And that's why through the 30s, and then of course the Depression put the end to it anyway, that was what ended the mobile Chautauquas. Muskoka Chautauqua was different because, like others in the United States, it operated at a fixed venue, as we are doing right now, and with a fixed program. And people come and somebody speaks, and it takes place beside a lake in Muskoka. And the first time this happened was in 1916 when Charles Applegath, who was an ordained minister of the Methodist Church, here at Windermere House, convened a meeting, what was called at that time the Epworth League, which was part of the branch operation of the Methodist Church. And it was quite successful, doing what the other Chautauquas had done, emphasis on books and reading and philosophy and discussions, sitting relaxed beside the lake, looking at the stars, being in communion with the higher purposes of why we're here on a planet. And so the next year he needed more space. You know, the Aikens weren't building the additions on fast enough. and so they went over to where the Loves were ahead of the game, and Elgin House had more space. And so for the next 3 years, from 17, 18, about 4 or 5 years, they were meeting at Elgin House. But Charles Applegath and his bride happened to go over to Tobin's Island, apostrophe S in those days, and see that the Woodosca Lodge was for sale. And he made it happen that he bought it and changed the name to Epworth Lodge. Epworth House as a kind of politic nod to the church, the Methodist Church. But by this point, Muskoka Chautauqua had broken way out from any religion like that. It was, we won't go further into that, but I just want to say that from 1922, they were meeting on Tobin's Island. And by about 1926, Dr. Marta Alty came and pleaded the case for Canadian books, Canadian literature. Now, this is one very impressive woman. First woman in Canada to have a doctorate of laws from Queen's University. First woman school inspector anywhere in the British Empire. And she had written in 1926 an educator's creed, which was basically her manifesto as a teacher. And what would somebody who felt as they were awakening to this new sense of the Canadian nation, what would they feel about the books that youngsters were getting in the curriculum and in the universities and so on? Well, we were absolutely on the end of the colonial drain pipe from Britain and the United States. There were a number of books being written by Canadians, well written on important subjects. But where were they? They weren't available anywhere because booksellers and even book publishers in this country were doing very well, thank you, just importing books from Britain and from the United States. So Canadians would be very happy just reading in awe about all the great things that Britain had done and, was doing, and the wonderful, amazing things the Americans were up to. And, to the extent that books are mirrors to society that produces them, we were looking at that page in these books and never seeing ourselves. And so her idea was that had to change. And that we needed Canadian publishers who were doing more than just either importing American and U.S. books or becoming the licensed publishers for Canadian editions of them, with maybe somebody would write a little preface or something, but the guts of the book was still the same, right? And they began, and there were major Canadian authors coming to Muskoka Chautauqua all through the 20s and all through the 30s. The big names, for sure. And so that's why, as this advocacy for Canadian literature to be part of the school curriculum, for Canadian books to start getting attention and that they deserved, and that we were, as Canadians, were entitled to be receiving, was the wheels under that movement were placed on that here at Muskoka Chautauqua, Tobin's Island. And those of you that have come over from Tobin's Island to be here this afternoon, now that Prohibition has been repealed, you can toast that when you get back. It was another great thing about Muskoka Chautauqua. So now what we're going to do is dip back in, if we're not out of time already, should I keep going a bit? Okay. Just one other thing then to finish off that bit about major phenomena that were going on. After the war, there was a lot of upheaval and turmoil in Canadian society. Big questions were being asked. How come you could come up with those multi billions of dollars to fund the war when we didn't have any of that money before, to build federal wharves or, post offices or anything else? And also farmers were really, really annoyed because they did not like conscription. If you're running a farm and you got 3 or 4 sons, you don't want them being hauled off and sent to Europe to die in somebody else's damn war. And who's going to run the farm? Who's going to guarantee the food supply for the Canadian people? And the exports of food products to other countries that help our balance of payments. So across the country, farm communities, farm families opposed conscription. And at the start of the war, Prime Minister Borden said in Halifax in December of 1914, there will be no conscription for this war. And the pledge had been to send 25,000 Canadian soldiers. Now, if you were watching a parade go through Windermere of 25,000 soldiers, it would take a long time to pass, and you would be impressed by the number who were going over. By 1917, Canada was now committing to 500,000 soldiers, 500,000, because the industrialized slaughter on the Western Front, as our troops were being commanded by the Commander-in-Chief of the British Army on the continent, Alexander Haig, who believed that God was directing him, that he actually was fulfilling a divine mission to send and order these charges across no man's land into well-entrenched German machine gun and artillery positions. And if it didn't work out, well, he could point out that the troops weren't well trained, the weather wasn't good that day, or some other excuse, right? Why is this dangling off? I feel like I'm wearing a long earring on one side, and I'm not accustomed to that. So I like Scotch, but I will never ever drink Hague Scotch, because so many Canadians would still have been alive, and their great grandchildren would be here today had Alexander Haig stayed with his family's distillery up in Scotland, and instead of thinking that he was a great commander. Wellington, who led the British forces at defeating Napoleon on a Sunday in June in 1815, was all about defense, and he practiced and found every way he could to fight and win his battles with the fewest number of his soldiers dying. Very defensive-minded combat, and that was only a century before Haig had the reins passed to him. So these were all kinds of reasons that were in the political context. And in 1919, in Ontario, women had the right to vote for the first time, and the outcome of that was that the Conservatives and the Liberals elected very few members to Queen's Park, and the United Farmers of Ontario, who didn't even have a leader, it was just like a movement, they elected 54. And workers, the labor movement, elected 11 more. And that number outvoted the opposition, the Liberals and the Conservatives. And so they formed a coalition government. And we had a farmer government in Ontario from 1919 to 1923. And during that time, this example from Ontario rippled west, and in Alberta, in British Columbia, in 1921, there was a farmer government elected, and then in the following year in Alberta, 1922, UFA, United Farmers of Alberta government. So this was a big agrarian revolt, and it certainly included the feelings about conscription and all of that, but and people and urbanization within Ontario and a lot of issues. And it wasn't just in the province; it was nationally. The progressive movement across the United States and in Canada was really moving forward. And while it had a lot of appeal in rural areas, it was also of much interest to city dwellers, because the progressive movement was all about modernity, and so the Ontario's creation of the hydroelectric utility, privatizing, nationalizing, or public ownership of what had been private power companies. These were the things that were coming in this progressive spirit across the country. And so in the federal election of 1926, there was a lot of progressive members were elected to House of Commons, including from Muskoka. And so that's just to say that there were a lot of big things that were happening in the social, kind of political realm. But quickly, I'm going to talk about some of the technology changes that made the 20s really roar. You've already heard the intro and the extro for the civil aviation. Well, I'll just fill in the middle part. Manned flight really took off during the Second World War. So airplanes were being used to bomb and strafe and to take photographs, as well as moving strategic movement. But the key thing was the aerial reconnaissance. This brought a whole new dimension to mapping. So at the end of the war, there was a surplus of these aircraft. And in Canada, both in Quebec and in Ontario, there were some very enterprising people who thought that these aircraft could be of great use in, for example, fighting forest fires. Don't we know it when we look around our province and the country and the world today? And so there was one that was called the flying boat. The prototype was a U.S. aircraft. De Havilland began to manufacture a version of it in Canada, and it had pontoons and wheels, and so this is when Ontario, by 1919, established a provincial air force under the Department of Lands and Forests, and initially contracting the work out to the Quebecers, who were about a year ahead in this. They were flying these missions for private logging companies in Quebec who wanted to be sure that forest fires were under control. And within a couple of years, this thing had really blossomed in Ontario. And there was aerial photography, there was sketching of forests from above, and there was use of the aircraft in directing forest fire fighting in a variety of ways. And in fact, Muskoka District was one of 3 areas in the province that was singled out for special testing through the 1920s. So civil aviation had that application, but the first commercial flights in Canada were between Toronto, down by the island airport, and here, Lake Rosso. Because Billy Bishop and one of his colleagues, who were both World War I aces, began flying commercial flights between Toronto and Muskoka, early 20s. It had helped that it was Lady Eaton who was, the best customer, because, it helped. And there are a lot of great photographs of Billy Bishop pulling up, including at Muskoka Chautauqua, in his airplane at the boat, at the docks over at Tobin's Island. But airplanes were also being used for mail, and the first solo flights from like Ottawa to Vancouver, non-stop flights carrying mail in the 1920s. All these things were happening, and civil aviation was opening up many new dimensions, including for police work. Then we have another revolution taking place on the ground. That's the automobile revolution. There's a picture in my book, Muskokans Fight the Great War. It shows in the end of August, when Prime Minister Borden had already just left and gone back to Ottawa. The train was pulling in at Bracebridge Station with Minister of War Sam Hughes on board. and there were 2 bands out and 14 automobiles, the full complement of town of Bracebridge cars at that time, owned by the doctors and lawyers and so on. By the end of the war, you could turn that number around. Despite the problem of getting motor vehicles, there would have been 41, and then another few years you could start adding the zeros. And the manufacturing of automobiles really took off. Roads were being improved. They had to be. And the trip from Toronto by car would, a couple days journey, and using 2 or 3 spares at least, jacking up and replacing. Not the advertised 2 hours today. But up until then, land transport had basically been by horse, right? And horses were so important a century ago. There were millions and millions and millions of them, including in the war. Those of you that saw the movie War Horse, saw the play War Horse, know how it was for one, and others. But there were millions of horses, and the Canadians from Muskoka who were in our forestry corps over there, they had horse teams. They're pulling logs out of the woods that they were cutting them in Belgium and France and Scotland and Britain, just as if they were still logging, right here, finishing off that log. And so horses were everywhere, pulling everything, sleighs in winter, buggies and wagons in the summer, and being ridden. And so everywhere there were livery stables, right? And big crop of hay, supporting all that from the farms. So as the motor vehicles started arriving, well, where did you get your gasoline? At first you went to the drugstore, because they were selling other, hazardous liquid items, right? So that was, and so you would go to the drugstore and they'd have, but that didn't last long, because entrepreneurs kind of moved in and figured there's more of a market here than that. And so we began to see gas stations appearing, and over time, livery stables disappearing, and more cars coming and fewer horses. And so that really began the automobile revolution, that by the 1950s, it took until after the Second World War and the prosperity then, with so many people being able to have a car for their own family and better roads, that they preferred to being able to drive instead of come on the rigid train schedules, and to go directly to their cottage, not have to make some other alternate arrangement for the final end from the train station in. And so that is when, in the 50s, we start to see the end of the golden age of the steamships and the resorts that the steamships brought their customers to. So that's why you call it a revolution, because it was really fundamentally transforming Muskoka. As I said at the beginning, the essentials were still intact. A lot of people close at hand wanted to get up onto the Canadian Shield for the pine trees and the rocks and the water and the clean air and being close to nature, but the way of doing it, because by the 1920s it was also by automobile and airplane getting here. So let's just leave the technology bit, well, except to say I mentioned about radio, and I talked about the movies that were coming in. On radio, it was 1925 that Edward Samuel Rogers brought to market his radio that operated without with a new kind of battery that he had invented. The first and only person in the world to invent that. And it transformed radio reception worldwide. And basically up until then, batteries in radios were run by batteries, acidic batteries. And they had to be recharged frequently, and there was a humming that went with them, right? And sometimes the humming was louder than the music that you were trying to listen to, right? Sounds like some old refrigerators sometimes, right? Well, what he invented did away with the battery. And then when he opened his radio station, CFRB, that was Canadian frequency, battery-less Rogers. Rogers, CFRB, Rogers battery-less. Later they dropped the less because it was too confusing. But Rogers, they talked about Rogers. And that was the beginning of 1010 on your dial if you're a Torontonian. And then it was in the early 1960s, of course, that his son, that Rogers, Edward Rogers, was born in 1900, and his son, who was born in June of 1933, he called him the same, Edward Samuel Rogers. So they had to stick junior on the end. So Ted Rogers that we all knew was, the junior of that guy. But he sat over on Tobin's Island and made all the decisions in the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s that were leading to what made Rogers into this conglomerate in media and communications. So any of you that were watching the Blue Jays split that doubleheader with the Red Sox yesterday, you were watching a baseball team owned by Rogers, in a stadium owned by Rogers, you know, brought to you on a network, you know, owned by Rogers. Like, I mean, thank goodness for Tobin's Island and the tranquility that it gave to Ted as he was brilliantly putting together his business plan that ultimately led to that. So radio had a huge impact from the 1920s. And the mail service was very rapid as well. The trains were carrying mail that was sorted on the trains. They had special mail cars. The steamboats that were coming up had 2 to 3 times delivering mail a day. And the airplanes were flying with mail service as well. And in Muskoka, with our seasonal economy and resorts and summer camps, we had dozens of summer post offices, all with their distinctive names: camp this, camp that, resort this, resort that. And they'd open up in the spring and they'd close down in the fall. But a lot of people don't know that that was the extent to which mail service was so important in the 1920s and had been up until then. Penny postage, you know, was guaranteeing inexpensive mail throughout the British Empire, then the British Commonwealth. And early in 1914, just before the Great War, the Borden government introduced parcel post, which turned out to be very helpful when the war came on, because all the care packages that were being sent to soldiers. But mail was really important because nothing else like it was existing. So those were some of the new technologies that made the 20s roar. So let's just wind up now with some of the more social phenomenon. It was a very important time for women to be discovering and exercising new freedom, liberation from structures that had been designed by men, and only men could vote, you know, for who would be in the municipal councils and the provincial legislature and the House of Commons, enacting laws. And then those laws were enforced by policemen, and if went to a court case, the judges were all male. And the laws that had been enacted reflected a long period of cultural second position for women, not a sense of equality as we understand it today and as it is enshrined in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So I've already mentioned about the right to vote in elections from during the 1920s for women. Now, an anomaly was that women couldn't be weren't appointed. They were getting elected to the House of Commons and the provincial legislature. Nellie McClung elected as a progressive, and some of them as United Farm Organization representatives. And they were doing a lot of other very important things with the Women's Institute and how that was empowering women in local communities. Started by a woman in the Niagara Peninsula. Really, really great, empowering organization for women in ways that mattered at the community level. But in the Constitution, and it talks about persons being appointed to the Senate. Now, why anybody would want to be in the Senate, that outrageous relic. Did you miss the Senate in Ontario? We ditched our Senate coming into Confederation in 1867. And I've been in public life a lot, and I've never heard any Ontarian say, Patrick, you know, we need that chamber of sober second thought in Toronto, so when the legislature's passed and debated and passed a bill, they can have another go at it, you build your house, right? You got it all done, it looks great. Are you calling up another contractor to come in and say, no, rebuild this? No. That anachronism, John Turner did his thesis at UBC, and he described the Senate. It was on the Senate, because he was puzzled by why it was even still there. He'd grown up in Ottawa. And he called it a functionless oddity. And it is, it still is, it still is. But the fact that women couldn't be in the Senate was an issue, right? And if you're going to fight, you got to fight everywhere you got to battle, right? And do it. So there were 5 women who got together in Alberta and challenged this provision in the Constitution. And we had a Supreme Court in Canada from 1875, but its decision could still be appealed to the, the colonial seat of government in London, where the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council would, without any understanding of our country, no knowledge of how a federal system of government works, they would play loosey-goosey with our whole system and saddle us with really outrageous decisions most of the time. But in this case, they, because the Canadian Supreme Court judges didn't think much about that there'd be a woman in the Senate. I mean, all these men, as they talked it over, no. It seems to say persons. Well, so the issue was whether a woman was a person, right? So this became known as the persons case. And so in this one instance, chalk went up for the Judicial Committee in London because they said, well, those rules really belong to a more barbaric time than we're now living in. So, and that's why we were able to get women senators, and that's why we have the famous 5 bronze monuments on Parliament Hill that nobody is trying to deface or paint red or remove. So, okay. But women were really coming into their own big way in the 20s. With wartime work, women had, of necessity, because with conscription and everything, there were jobs in the fields. Like on the front cover of my book, Muskokans Fight the Great War, there's a picture of all these soldiers marching from the Muskoka's 122nd Overseas Battalion, their 100-mile march around Muskoka, coming over the bridge in Port Carling. And it's a very impressive scene if you want to see what it looks like when you're depopulating the farms, right? And so on the back cover is the other side, the flip side of the story. It shows 2 women up in North Muskoka getting the hay into the barn, right? So women were moving into jobs that men had vacated, on the fields and in the factories, clerking in shops, being secretaries, being nurses, and teachers. And it was through the 20s that, with changes in the economy, more jobs were opening up in the economy, particularly of a secretarial nature, but that women were moving into. There were still kind of those, little isolated areas, but there was a spread underway. But another big change came with the style. I mean, the 20s, this was Art Deco. Welcome Art Deco. And jazz, and then the music and dance, flappers. There were women who were flappers, right? Well, what was a flapper? Well, she wasn't wearing the corset. I mean, talk about liberating women. There's the first biggest liberation possible, right? That's right up there with Chinese foot binding, right? And so, instead of, and not the little fur-lined, the fur-lined things, and the frills, beautiful dresses are just the shape, right? And hair short, and then a nice hat, bob and binding breasts and hips so that they, in the silhouette look in these great new dresses, they had the figure of their 16-year-old brother, and it was just a totally new look. A lot to go along with, the cigarette holder and the cigarettes and the handbag, and the high heel shoes, and you're stepping out and dance steps like nobody had thought they were possible, and there they were flapping and just enjoying life. So that was a big thing about the 20s. It was anything was possible. enjoy life and get rich. And getting rich is what a lot of people did, because all these secretaries who were now working in offices, and especially in the big cities and so on, they were picking up these tips, and they were seeing how you buy shares. And you could do it on margin, and you could do this and do that. And everybody was becoming, like, on paper, millionaires. You know, you didn't just have to be old Toronto families to come up and have a big acreage on Tobin's Island or on the mainland. Everybody was just in the game, buying shares and everything. And this created this great bubble, and that went on until, you know, the crash that ended the 20s in a spectacular way. But those were some of the things that were changing how people were living in that new era. And you don't need a summary from me about what was different and what's the same over a century, right? 3 generations or so. The point is that change is inevitable. It's with us all the time. Technology has continued apace to revamp how we do so many things. And yet there are enduring values of community that continue. And places like Muskoka District that continue to have this cultural tug-of-war between, you know, its two halves. And sometimes that gets intense over issues about, you know, density versus solitude, noise versus tranquility, you know, and that kind of thing. But these battles are not new to us. They have been part of what's been going on since the 1860s and 70s in this district. And when 100 years from now they're having Chautauqua meetings here, we're still talking about, you know, how those essentials of our time and place in this part of Canada make us very fortunate if we have our eyes to recognize it as Canadians and our minds set in a Canadian mindset to value it and do something in our own lives that's possible to achieve it. And I'm very grateful to be with you under the big tent here in Chautauqua, and thank you for your patience and listen to all. Thank you. Thank you. I forgot to mention that I had this little book here. I was going to pass it around, but so it as well as the overhead airplanes could have distracted attention. But because I do a monthly radio broadcast. Some of you might hear it. It's on Hunters Bay Radio, Boyer's Modern History of Muskoka, and but I send a link to it to a lot of people that are interested in Muskoka history. And I'm going to say, if you want to add your email address to this, then I can do that. Yeah, pass it around. Because in some parts of Muskoka, like the town of Bracebridge, it's very hard to get the reception from 88.7 on your FM dial. But it's also somewhat of a challenge sometimes to get up at 7 a.m. on Saturday morning to listen to Boyer talk about history, right? And especially when it's only once a month. So is this a Saturday, or was that maybe? So if you want, you sign that up and just, especially your email address, and then I can get you on that list. I appreciated your applause, and I thank you for it. And one of the things they did at Chautauqua, they had their customs, and so some of their meetings would be in restaurant. Like, I have a picture, and Gail, you and I have looked at these pictures, like the big dining ballroom at the Royal York Hotel, and like that, where there's 1,000 or 2,000 people sitting there with the white linen tablecloth, and they're hearing some speaker, and then they'd have what they called the Chautauqua salute. So, you know, they'd have white linen tablecloths there. So, at the end of it, they didn't bother with a standing ovation. They'd all just do this. So that's another way. You know, if you go to more Chautauqua events, and you don't want to bruise your hands too much, you can just do give a Chautauqua salute, and that's what I'm doing to you. Thank you. I'm saluting you.